Anacharsis walked into the heart of ancient Greek civilization and made the Greeks feel like barbarians. He was a prince from the steppes, a man who wore trousers and spoke with a foreign accent. He had never seen a gymnasium, never debated in a courtroom, never studied under a philosopher. And yet, when he arrived in Athens, he didn't just impress the Greeks. He left them speechless. He looked at their laws and called them spiderwebs, strong enough to catch small flies, but useless against the big ones. He watched their athletes and wondered why they honored men who beat each other bloody. He stood before Solon himself and, with a single sentence, proved that wisdom does not belong to any one nation. A Scythian prince, a foreigner, a barbarian, and he was one of them, one of the seven sages of Greece. Some lists of the wise men included him alongside Solon and Thales. Others replaced Myson with his name. The historian Ephorus and the philosopher Plutarch both placed him among the chosen few. For the Greeks, he was both an outsider and a model, the embodiment of what they called the wise barbarian, a man of natural intelligence who had not been corrupted by the refinements of civilization. The Cynic philosophers saw him as a noble savage, a figure of uncorrupted virtue who stood as a mirror to the vices of Athens. And his reputation grew beyond philosophy. He was credited with inventing the anchor with two flukes, the potter's wheel, and even an improved sail. He was the first foreigner ever to be granted Athenian citizenship, and his blunt, unpolished speech gave rise to a phrase that would echo through the centuries: Scythian eloquence. But here's the twist. For all his wit, all his wisdom, all his inventions, Anacharsis could not save himself. When he returned to his homeland, he was killed by his own brother for performing a foreign religious ritual. His death was as tragic as his life was brilliant. And yet, his name did not fade. It reappeared in Roman literature, in Christian apologetic, in Renaissance art, and even in the pages of American literature. Herman Melville called his ship's crew an Anacharsis Klutzdeputation, a phrase that would puzzle most readers today, but which carries with it the ghost of a Scythian prince who, 2,500 years ago, dared to walk into the heart of Greek civilization and show the Greeks what they had forgotten: that wisdom is not a possession. It is a way of seeing. So tonight, close your eyes, let go of your own assumptions, and listen to the story of the man who taught Greece a lesson it would never forget: the story of Anacharsis, the wise barbarian. In the vast grasslands that stretched north of the Black Sea, where the sky met the earth in a flat, unbroken line, and where the wind carried the smell of horses and dry grass, there lived a people whom the Greeks called Scythians, and these Scythians were nomads. They had no cities and no written laws, but they had something that the Greeks, with all their civilization, often lacked, and that was a deep, unshakable sense of freedom. And they were also famous for their skill in warfare, for their horsemanship, and for the strange, almost barbaric customs that fascinated and frightened the Greeks in equal measure. And among these Scythians, in the royal family, there was born a prince who was destined to leave his homeland and travel to the very heart of the civilized world, a prince whose name, Anacharsis, meant, according to the most plausible interpretation, invulnerable or unwounded, a name that suggested strength, resilience, and the ability to survive any blow. And this name, which came from the ancient Scythian language, from the roots ana, meaning without, and var, meaning to wound, was not just a label, but a prophecy, because Anacharsis would indeed prove to be invulnerable to the flattery and the corruptions of the Greek world, though, in the end, he would not be invulnerable to the hatred of his own people. His father was Eurus, the king of the Scythians, and his brothers were Solus and Catitus, who would both rule after their father. And this meant that Anacharsis was not just a prince, but a prince of the blood, a man who could have stayed in the steppes and lived a life of power and privilege. But something drove him away from the familiar world of his childhood and towards a world that was utterly alien to him. And that something was, perhaps, the influence of his mother, who, according to some accounts, was a Greek woman, a woman who had been taken as a wife or a concubine by the Scythian king, and who had taught her son the language and the stories of her own people. And this dual heritage, this mixture of Scythian and Greek blood, made Anacharsis a man of two worlds, a man who could see the faults of both, and a man who could not rest content in either. And when we think about this strange beginning, about the mixture of cultures that shaped his character, we begin to understand why he became the man he did, why he left the steppes behind, and why he walked, in the end, into the very heart of the Greek world, not as a conqueror, but as a questioner, a critic, and a seeker of wisdom. Before we follow Anacharsis to Athens, we must understand the world he came from, because without understanding Scythia, we cannot understand the man, and we cannot understand why the Greeks found him so fascinating and so unsettling at the same time. And Scythia, in the 6th century before our era, was not a place that the Greeks could easily comprehend, because it was a world without cities, a world without temples, a world without the written laws that the Greeks valued so highly, and a world where the very concept of private property was alien, because the Scythians were nomads who moved with their herds across the vast grasslands that stretched from the Danube to the Don, and they lived not in stone houses, but in wagons covered with felt, and their wealth was not measured in gold or silver, but in horses and cattle, and their gods were not the beautiful, human-like deities of Olympus, but the wild, elemental forces of nature, and their customs, to the Greeks, seemed barbaric and even shocking, because they drank the blood of their enemies. They used the scalps of their defeated foes as trophies, and they believed that the greatest honor was to die in battle, while a natural death was considered a disgrace. And yet, for all their apparent savagery, the Scythians possessed a kind of wisdom that the Greeks, with all their philosophy and their art, sometimes lacked, because they had a deep, intuitive understanding of the rhythms of nature, of the importance of freedom, and of the futility of accumulating wealth and possessions. And they knew, as the Greeks did not, that the only true wealth is the wealth of the spirit, the wealth of the clan, and the wealth of the open steppe. Anacharsis was a prince of this world, a man who had grown up on horseback, who had learned to shoot a bow before he could read, and who had witnessed the brutal realities of nomadic life. But he had also, through his Greek mother, been exposed to another world, a world of cities and laws and philosophy. And this dual perspective, this ability to see the world through two different sets of eyes, made him a man who could not be satisfied with the simple certainties of his own culture, and it drove him, eventually, to leave the steppes and journey to the heart of the Greek world, not as a conqueror, but as a seeker, a man who wanted to understand the strange, civilized people who lived to the south, and who, in the process, would come to understand himself. One of the most important and most intriguing facts about Anacharsis, and one that explains much of his character and his later destiny, is that his mother was a Greek woman, and this detail, which is mentioned by several ancient authors, transforms him from a simple Scythian prince into a figure of cultural hybridity, a man who was born on the border between two worlds and who, from his earliest childhood, was exposed to two different languages, two different religions, and two different ways of understanding the world, because his mother, whether she was a wife, a concubine, or simply a captive taken by the Scythian king, taught him the language of her homeland, the stories of her people, and the customs that she had left behind when she was taken from her Greek city. And this education, which was given to him in secret, perhaps, or openly, according to the customs of the Scythian court, made him a bilingual, bicultural man, a man who could speak Greek as fluently as he spoke the Scythian tongue, and who could understand the values of both cultures, even when those values were in direct conflict with each other. And this dual perspective gave him a critical distance from both worlds, because he could see the flaws of Scythian society through the eyes of a Greek, and he could see the flaws of Greek society through the eyes of a Scythian. And this ability to see the world from two different angles made him one of the most acute observers and one of the most penetrating critics of his time. It was this education, this Greek mother, that gave him the courage to leave the steppes and sail to Greece, because he did not travel as a complete stranger, but as a man who had already, in a sense, been initiated into the Greek language and the Greek way of thinking. And it was this Greek mother who gave him the ability to engage with the great minds of Athens, to converse with Solon and with other intellectuals, and to win their respect, despite his foreign accent and his barbarian clothes. And when we think of this woman, whose name history has not preserved, we must imagine her as a figure of enormous influence, a woman who was, perhaps, captured by the Scythians during one of their raids on the Greek colonies on the Black Sea, and who found herself in a foreign land, married to a foreign king, but who never forgot her homeland, and who passed on her love of Greek culture to her son, giving him the tools he needed to become one of the most remarkable figures of his age. It was around the year 589 before the Common Era, during the archonship of Eucrates, which corresponded to the 47th Olympiad, that Anacharsis arrived in Athens, and his arrival was not a casual visit, nor was it the journey of a simple traveler, for he came as an ambassador, a diplomat sent by his brother, King Solus, on a mission to the Greek city. And this diplomatic status gave him a certain dignity and a certain protection, but it also placed him in a position of great responsibility and great danger, because he was representing not just himself, but his entire people, and he had to navigate the complex and often treacherous currents of Greek politics while remaining true to his own Scythian identity. This was precisely the time when Solon was at the height of his power and influence, the time when the great Athenian lawgiver was busy drafting his famous reforms, and his reforms were aimed at curbing the power of the aristocracy, at relieving the burden of debt on the poor, and at establishing a more just and more equitable political system. And Anacharsis, who had heard of Solon's wisdom and his reputation, was eager to meet him, to learn from him, and to test his own ideas against those of the greatest thinker in Greece. The encounter between the two men was to become one of the most famous encounters in Greek history, and it was not simply a meeting of minds, but a meeting of two worlds, the world of the steppe and the world of the city, and the dialogue between them, which has been preserved in various forms by ancient historians, shows us how a man from a completely different culture could challenge the assumptions of the Greeks and force them to question their own values. Anacharsis arrived in Athens with nothing but his wits, his courage, and his sharp, penetrating intelligence, and he was about to show the Athenians that wisdom was not the exclusive property of the Greeks, and that a man who wore trousers and spoke with a foreign accent could, In fact, see more clearly than those who had been educated in the finest schools of philosophy. When Anacharsis arrived at the house of Solon, he did not send a formal request for an audience, nor did he wait for an invitation, for he was a man of direct action, a man who believed that the most important things in life were best said face to face, without the mediation of secretaries and servants. And so he walked up to the door of the great lawgiver, knocked boldly, and when the servant opened the door, he said, in his clear but slightly accented Greek, "Anacharsis has come and wishes to see Solon, and, if possible, to become his guest." This was a bold request for a foreigner to ask to become the guest of the most powerful man in Athens. But Anacharsis was not a man who was easily intimidated, and he was confident in his own worth and in the value of his own ideas. And Solon, who was known for his wisdom and his hospitality, sent back a reply that was equally bold, equally witty, and equally revealing of the Greek way of thinking, for he said, "It is customary for people to invite guests from their own country." This was a diplomatic way of saying that Anacharsis, as a foreigner, should not presume to expect the same hospitality as a Greek citizen. But Anacharsis, quick as a flash, replied, "Now that I am in your country, it is proper for me to invite guests." This reply was a masterstroke of wit, because it turned Solon's logic on its head, because Anacharsis was pointing out that, since he was now in Greece, he was, in a sense, the host, and Solon was the guest. And this simple reversal of roles, this clever twist of words, was enough to make Solon laugh, to make him realize that he was dealing with a man of extraordinary intelligence. And he immediately opened his door and invited Anacharsis inside. And from that moment on, they became friends and intellectual companions. And their friendship was to become one of the most famous friendships in the ancient world, a friendship that crossed the boundaries of culture and language and proved that true wisdom is universal, and that a man from the steppes could be as wise as a man from the city, and that the most important thing in life is not where you come from, but what you have to say. Now that Anacharsis had gained access to Solon and established himself as a man of wit and intelligence, he began to observe the city of Athens with the sharp, critical eye of an outsider, and what he saw shocked him, not because it was barbaric or primitive, but because it was so full of contradictions, so full of things that seemed, to his Scythian mind, absurd, irrational, and even hypocritical. And he did not keep his observations to himself, because he was a man who spoke his mind, a man who believed that the truth, however uncomfortable, was always better than a comfortable lie, and his blunt, unpolished remarks began to circulate throughout the city, making him both admired and feared, because he had a way of pointing out the flaws in Greek society that made the Greeks themselves uncomfortable. He looked at their athletes, for example, the men who competed in the Olympic Games, and he wondered why the Greeks honored those who beat each other bloody, while they punished those who committed violence in the streets. And he asked, with genuine curiosity, if it is wrong to hit someone, why do you reward those who do it in the stadium? He looked at their laws, and he compared them to a spider's web, because a spider's web, as he observed, is strong enough to catch small flies, but it cannot hold a large wasp or a hornet, which bursts through it easily. And he said that the laws of Athens were exactly the same, because they could catch the poor and the weak, but they could not touch the rich and the powerful, who simply broke through them without any consequences. He looked at their commerce, at the way the Athenians bought and sold goods, and he was amazed that they punished liars in their courts, while they allowed merchants to lie about the quality of their wares and the price of their goods. And he said that the Greeks, who prided themselves on their justice, were, in fact, the most unjust people he had ever encountered, because they had one set of rules for themselves and another set of rules for foreigners, and they enforced their laws strictly against the weak, but they bent them freely for the strong. And when he said these things, the Athenians did not know whether to be angry or to laugh, because they knew, in their hearts, that he was telling the truth, and they were not used to having their own assumptions so mercilessly exposed by a man who wore trousers and spoke with a foreign accent. And this, perhaps, was the most shocking thing of all, because Anacharsis was not a philosopher who had studied in the schools of Greece. He was a man who had simply observed the world with an open mind, and his observations were more penetrating than those of many men who had spent their entire lives studying philosophy. As the days passed and Anacharsis continued to wander through the streets of Athens, observing, questioning, and speaking his mind with that blunt, unpolished honesty that the Greeks had never encountered before, his reputation grew, and the Athenians, who had initially been shocked and even offended by his criticisms, began to see him in a different light, because they realized that his words, however uncomfortable, were not motivated by malice or by a desire to insult, but by a genuine curiosity and a genuine love of truth, and they began to call him the wise barbarian, a phrase that was both an honor and a reminder of his foreign origin, because it acknowledged that he possessed a kind of wisdom that was different from, and perhaps even superior to, the wisdom of the Greeks, a wisdom that was not learned in the schools of philosophy, but was born of a life lived in close contact with nature, with the rhythms of the seasons, and with the harsh realities of survival in the steppes. The Greeks, who had a deep respect for wisdom and who had made it one of the central values of their culture, could not simply dismiss Anacharsis as a foreigner who did not understand their ways, because he understood them all too well, and his understanding was so sharp and so penetrating that it made them question their own beliefs, and they began to see him not as a barbarian, but as a man who had something valuable to teach them, a man who could show them the blind spots in their own culture, and a man who could remind them of the simple virtues that they had lost in their pursuit of sophistication and refinement. The phrase wise barbarian was not an insult, but a recognition that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, and that the Greeks, who prided themselves on their civilization, could learn something from a man who had grown up on horseback in the vast grasslands of Scythia. And this idea, the idea that a foreigner could be wiser than a Greek, was a revolutionary idea, and it spread throughout the city, making Anacharsis both famous and, in some circles, feared, because he represented a challenge to the very foundations of Greek identity, a challenge that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. Now, among the many encounters that Anacharsis had during his time in Athens, there was one that was particularly significant, because it was not a meeting with a Greek philosopher or a Greek statesman, but a meeting with a man who was, like him, a Scythian, a man who had also left the steppes and journeyed to the heart of the Greek world. And this man was Toxaris, a noble Scythian who was known among the Greeks as a physician and a sage, and whose reputation for wisdom and for healing was almost as great as that of Anacharsis himself. We do not know exactly when or how they met, but we can imagine the scene, because it must have been a remarkable moment, a moment when two men from the same distant land, two men who had grown up on horseback under the vast Scythian sky, found themselves in the crowded, noisy streets of Athens, surrounded by marble temples and busy marketplaces and the constant chatter of philosophers and politicians. And they must have felt a kind of kinship, a recognition that they were both strangers in a strange land, and that they shared something that the Greeks could not fully understand. Now, among all the honors that were bestowed upon Anacharsis during his stay in Athens, there was one that stood out above all others, one that marked him as a truly exceptional figure in the eyes of the Athenians, and this was the granting of Athenian citizenship, an honor that was rarely given to foreigners, and which made him the first foreigner in the history of Athens to receive the privileges of citizenship. To understand how extraordinary this was, we must remember that the Athenians were famously proud of their city and their citizenship, and they guarded it jealously, because they believed that only those who were born of Athenian parents, who had Athenian blood flowing through their veins, could truly understand and uphold the values of their democracy, and they did not grant citizenship lightly, especially not to foreigners, whom they called metics, and who were usually allowed to live in the city and to trade, but were never given the full rights of citizens, including the right to vote, to hold public office, and to own land. And yet, in the case of Anacharsis, they made an exception, and the reason for this exception was not political calculation or diplomatic necessity, but genuine admiration for his wisdom and his character. The Athenians had seen many foreigners pass through their city, but they had never seen a foreigner like Anacharsis, a man who could speak their language with such fluency, who could engage their intellectuals in debate, who could challenge their assumptions with such wit and intelligence, and who could, in the end, teach them something about their own culture, and they felt that such a man deserved to be honored not as a visitor, but as one of their own, and this honor, which was both a recognition of his merit and a gesture of gratitude, was a testament to the deep impression he had made on the city, and it showed that, in the eyes of the Athenians, he was no longer a stranger, but a friend, a philosopher, and a fellow citizen. And when we think about what this meant for Anacharsis, we can imagine that he felt a mixture of pride and gratitude, and perhaps also a sense of belonging, because he had come to Athens as a foreigner, but he had left it as a citizen, and he knew that this honor was not something that was given lightly, but something that had to be earned, and that he had earned it not by force or by wealth, but by the power of his words and the strength of his character. And this must have been a source of deep satisfaction for a man who had traveled so far and who had risked so much to find wisdom in a foreign land. But we must also consider what this honor meant for the Athenians, because by granting citizenship to a Scythian, a man whom they would have called a barbarian, they were making a powerful statement about the nature of wisdom and the value of foreign cultures, and they were acknowledging that the boundaries between Greek and barbarian were not as absolute as they had previously believed, and that a man from the steppes could, in fact, embody the virtues that they most admired in this recognition, which was both generous and bold, must have caused a stir in Athens, and it must have been a subject of debate and discussion among the citizens, some of whom may have been shocked, while others may have been inspired, but all of whom were forced to reconsider their assumptions about what it meant to be Greek. There was one honor, however, that surpassed even the granting of citizenship, because it touched upon the most sacred and the most secret aspects of Greek religious life, and this was the initiation of Anacharsis into the Eleusinian mysteries, those ancient and sacred rites which were celebrated in honor of Demeter and Persephone, and which were considered the most holy and the most profound of all Greek religious ceremonies, and which were so secret that the uninitiated were forbidden even to speak of them. and which were so exclusive that they were not open to foreigners, and which were not even open to all Greeks, but only to those who spoke the Greek language properly, without a foreign accent, and who had been purified and prepared according to ancient traditions. The Eleusinian mysteries were not just a religious festival, they were a spiritual experience, a journey into the heart of the divine, a revelation of the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth, and they were believed to give the initiate a glimpse of the afterlife and the promise of a blessed existence beyond the grave. And to be initiated into them was to be admitted into the highest circle of Greek religious life, to be given access to the most sacred knowledge, and to become part of a community that was bound by secrecy and by a shared experience of the divine. The fact that Anacharsis, a Scythian, a foreigner, a man who wore trousers and spoke Greek with an accent, was initiated into these mysteries is a testament not only to the exceptional nature of his character, but also to the deep impression he had made on the Athenians, because they were willing to break with their own traditions and to admit a foreigner into their most sacred rites, something they rarely did, and something they would never have done for a man they did not trust or respect. For Anacharsis, this initiation must have been a profound and transformative experience, because it gave him access to a dimension of Greek culture that was hidden from most foreigners, and it allowed him to see the Greeks not just as a political and intellectual community, but as a religious community, a community that was bound together by shared beliefs and shared rituals, and he must have felt, as he participated in the secret ceremonies, that he was being admitted into the inner circle of Greek life, and that he was being given a gift that was beyond price. And this experience, which he could never speak of in detail, must have colored his understanding of the Greeks and their culture in ways that we can only guess at. After his long and transformative stay in Athens, Anacharsis, whose reputation as a wise man had now spread throughout the Greek world, undertook another journey, one that would take him to the court of one of the most powerful and most famous rulers of the ancient world, a king whose name would become synonymous with wealth and with the dangers of excessive pride. And this king was Croesus of Lydia, whose capital at Sardis was a byword for luxury, and whose treasury was said to contain more gold than any other kingdom on earth. And according to Diodorus Siculus and Diogenes Laertius, Anacharsis was among the wise men who were invited to the court of Croesus, where they engaged in philosophical discussions and offered their counsel on matters of state and on the nature of happiness and power. The presence of Anacharsis at the court of Croesus was not accidental, because Croesus, who was known for his love of Greek culture and his admiration for Greek wisdom, had made it a practice to invite the most famous philosophers and sages of the Greek world to his court, where he would consult them on important matters and where he would test his own ideas against theirs. And he had also a practical interest in Anacharsis, because the Persians, who were rising to power in the East, had asked him for advice on how to deal with the Scythians, and Croesus, who knew that the Scythians were a fierce and unpredictable people, was eager to learn more about them from a man who was both a Scythian and a philosopher, a man who could speak the language of the Scythians and the language of the Greeks, and who could explain the customs and the strategies of his people to a foreign king. The meeting between Anacharsis and Croesus, which is described by ancient historians as a meeting of minds, was also a meeting of two different worlds, the world of the steppes and the world of the city, the world of the nomad and the world of the king, and the conversations between them must have been fascinating, because Anacharsis, who had seen the hypocrisy of the Greeks, was not afraid to speak his mind to the king, and he told Croesus that wealth and power were not the same as happiness, and that the richest man in the world could still be the most miserable if he did not know how to use his wealth wisely, and if he did not have the respect of his people and the approval of the gods. Croesus, who was impressed by the sharpness of Anacharsis' mind and the honesty of his words, listened carefully and must have been struck by the contrast between the simple, straightforward wisdom of the Scythian prince and the more sophisticated, but often more self-serving, advice of his Greek courtiers, and he must have realized that Anacharsis was a man who could be trusted, a man who would not flatter him or lie to him. And this realization, which was both refreshing and disconcerting, made the visit of Anacharsis to the court of Sardis one of the most memorable events in the history of Croesus's reign. After his long and transformative stay in Athens, and after his memorable visit to the court of Croesus in Sardis, which must have taken place in the early years of that king's reign, around the year 560 before the Common Era, Anacharsis did not return to the steppes, but instead embarked on a journey that would take him through other great cities of Greece, because he was a man who could never stop learning, a man who believed that wisdom was not something that could be acquired in one place or from one teacher, but something that had to be sought out in every corner of the world. And he traveled from city to city, observing their customs, studying their laws, and engaging in conversation with their philosophers and their statesmen. And these travels, which are mentioned by several ancient sources, gave him an even deeper understanding of the Greek world and its contradictions. And they also allowed him to meet some of the most famous thinkers of his age, thinkers whose names would echo through history alongside his own. He visited Corinth, the wealthy and commercial city that was famous for its luxury and its vices, and which was also the home of Periander, one of the seven sages, that same Periander who had been praised for his wisdom and his justice, but who had also been feared for his cruelty. And Anacharsis must have been struck by the contrast between the prosperity of Corinth and the moral decay that he saw in its streets. And he must have wondered whether the wisdom of Periander was enough to save his city from the corruption that seemed to be eating away at its foundations. He visited Sparta, the city of warriors, a city whose laws were designed to create perfect soldiers and whose citizens lived a life of discipline and austerity that was unlike anything he had seen in Athens or in Corinth. And he must have been impressed by the courage and the endurance of the Spartans, but he must also have been disturbed by their harshness, by their disregard for individual freedom, and by their belief that the only purpose of life was to serve the state. And he must have wondered whether this was truly a model of wisdom or a form of madness dressed up in the robes of virtue. And it is recorded that he remarked that in Sparta, and only in Sparta, one could hold a reasonable conversation, because the Spartans, unlike the Athenians, were not always trying to impress each other with clever speeches and were not always seeking to outdo each other in displays of wit and intelligence, but were content to speak plainly and to listen carefully. And this observation, which was both a compliment and a criticism, must have pleased the Spartans and annoyed the Athenians in equal measure. He visited Miletus, the great city of Ionia, the birthplace of philosophy, the city where Thales, the first of the seven sages, had predicted an eclipse and had laid the foundations of Greek science, and where his followers, Anaximander and Anaximenes, had continued his work and had developed their own theories about the nature of the universe. And Anacharsis, who had heard of the fame of the Milesian philosophers, must have been eager to meet them and to learn from them, and he must have spent many hours in their company, discussing the nature of reality, the origins of the world, and the meaning of life. And these conversations, which are not recorded for us, must have been among the most stimulating and the most challenging that he ever had, because the Milesians were not content to accept the wisdom of the past, but were always seeking new explanations, new theories, and new ways of understanding the world. And their restless curiosity must have resonated with Anacharsis' own insatiable thirst for knowledge. He visited the other cities of Ionia, each with its own traditions and its own schools of thought, and each with its own contribution to the rich tapestry of Greek culture. And in all of these places, Anacharsis was not just a passive observer, but an active participant in the intellectual life of the cities, because he was a man who could hold his own in any debate, a man who could challenge the assumptions of the most learned philosophers, and a man whose sharp, penetrating intelligence made even the wisest Greeks stop and think, and his reputation, which had begun in Athens, spread throughout the Greek world, and he came to be seen not just as a wise barbarian, but as a symbol of the possibility that wisdom could be found outside the borders of Greece, a possibility that was both exciting and threatening to the Greeks who prided themselves on their culture and their learning. And when we think of Anacharsis, traveling from city to city, engaging in debate with the greatest minds of his age, we must imagine him as a man who was never satisfied, a man who was always seeking, always questioning, always pushing the boundaries of his own understanding, and a man who, in the process, forced the Greeks to question their own assumptions about the world and about themselves. Now, as we have followed Anacharsis from the steppes of Scythia to the courts of Athens, and from the courts of Athens to the palaces of Sardis, and from the palaces of Sardis to the streets of Corinth, Sparta, and Miletus, we must finally ask the question that has been hanging over this entire story. How is it possible that a man who wore trousers, who spoke with a foreign accent, who had never studied in a Greek school, and who had never held public office in a Greek city, came to be counted among the most revered figures in all of Greek culture, among the select group of men whom the Greeks called the Seven Sages, a group that included lawgivers like Solon, tyrants like Periander, and philosophers like Thales, men whose names were synonymous with wisdom, justice, and political power? The answer to this question is not simple, and it reveals something important about the nature of wisdom and the boundaries of Greek identity, because it shows that even the Greeks, who were famously proud of their culture and their learning, were willing to admit that wisdom could come from outside their borders, and that a man from the steppes could be as wise as a man from the city, and that the qualities that made a sage were not necessarily the qualities that made a citizen, but were rather the qualities of mind, character, and insight that could be found anywhere in the world. The inclusion of Anacharsis among the seven sages is attested by several ancient sources, including the historian Ephorus, who was a student of Isocrates and who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, and the philosopher Plutarch, who lived much later, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, and both of these authors, who were well acquainted with the Greek tradition of wisdom literature, included Anacharsis in their lists of the sages, replacing with his name another figure, Myson of Chini, who appears in some lists but who was not as well known or as well respected as the Scythian prince. This substitution is significant because it shows that the list of the seven sages was not a fixed canon, but a fluid and evolving tradition, and that different authors could include different figures depending on their own preferences and their own understanding of what constituted wisdom. And it also shows that Anacharsis, even though he was a foreigner, was considered by some of the most authoritative Greek thinkers to be worthy of the highest honor that the Greek world could bestow, and that his reputation was not confined to Athens or to Ionia, but had spread throughout the Greek world, and had even reached the ears of those who lived in the great cultural centers of the Mediterranean. The fact that Ephorus and Plutarch included Anacharsis in their lists of the sages, while excluding others who were Greek by birth, is a testament not only to his personal qualities, but also to the power of his ideas and the impact that he had on the Greek imagination. And it shows that the Greeks, for all their pride in their own culture, were capable of recognizing excellence wherever they found it. Now, the inclusion of Anacharsis among the seven sages was not simply a matter of honoring a foreign visitor. It was also the beginning of something far more significant, something that would echo through Greek literature and philosophy for centuries to come, because Anacharsis became the embodiment of a powerful idea, the idea of the wise barbarian. A figure from a non-Greek culture who possessed a natural wisdom that often surpassed the sophistication and the learning of the Greeks themselves. This idea was not entirely new, because the Greeks had always been aware that there were wise men in other lands, and they had always been willing to learn from the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. But Anacharsis was different, because he was not a king or a priest, but a man who had come to Greece as a stranger and who had, through his own intelligence and his own honesty, forced the Greeks to confront the contradictions in their own culture, and his example showed that wisdom was not a possession of any one nation, but a quality that could be found anywhere, and that the Greeks, who prided themselves on their learning and their culture, could learn something from a man who had grown up on horseback in the vast grasslands of Scythia. The Greeks called Anacharsis a wise barbarian, and this phrase, which might seem like an insult to modern ears, was in fact a recognition of his unique status, because it acknowledged that he was both an outsider and a sage, a man who had not been corrupted by the refinements of Greek civilization, but who had retained the simple, natural virtues of his own people, and who could therefore see the Greeks more clearly than they could see themselves. The Cynic philosophers, who were among the most radical and most influential thinkers of the Greek world, and who advocated a life of simplicity, self-sufficiency, and freedom from the conventions of society, were particularly drawn to the figure of Anacharsis, and they saw in him a model of the kind of life they were trying to promote, a life that rejected luxury, status, and the endless pursuit of wealth and power, and that embraced instead the virtues of poverty, honesty, and independence. For the Cynics, Anacharsis was not just a wise man, but a noble savage, a figure of uncorrupted virtue who stood as a mirror to the vices of Athens, and they used his example to argue that the Greeks had lost something essential in their pursuit of sophistication and refinement, and that the true path to happiness lay not in the accumulation of possessions, but in the cultivation of virtue and the rejection of luxury and excess. The Cynics also used the figure of Anacharsis to argue for the equality of all people, regardless of their nationality or their culture, because Anacharsis, as a Scythian, was a barbarian, and the Greeks, who believed that they were superior to all other peoples, looked down on barbarians as inferior beings. But Anacharsis, with his wisdom and his intelligence, proved that a barbarian could be as wise as any Greek, and that the distinction between Greek and barbarian was not a natural or a necessary one, but a social and a cultural one. And this argument was important for the Cynics, who believed that all human beings were equal in their capacity for reason and virtue, and that the only real distinction was between the wise and the foolish, not between the Greek and the barbarian. The letters of Anacharsis also contain passages in which Anacharsis criticizes the Greeks for their pride in their own culture, and he says that the Greeks are not wiser than the barbarians, because the gods have not taken away from the barbarians the ability to recognize what is beautiful and what is good. And this argument was a direct challenge to the Greek belief in their own superiority. And it reflected the Cynic conviction that wisdom was not a possession of any one nation, but a universal human quality that could be found everywhere, and that the task of the philosopher was to seek it out wherever it might be found, and to honor it whenever it was discovered, even if it was found in the most unexpected places and in the most unexpected people. And this image of Anacharsis, as a wise man from a simpler culture who stood outside the conventions of Greek society and who could therefore see it more clearly than those who were inside it, would continue to resonate through the ages because it spoke to a deep and enduring human longing, a longing for a simpler, more authentic way of life, a longing that is still with us today in our own age of anxiety and excess. And it is a testament to the power of Anacharsis' example that his image has survived for more than 2,500 years, and that his name is still remembered as a symbol of wisdom without pretension, honesty without flattery, and courage without arrogance, and that he became, in the hands of the Cynics, not just a historical figure, but a philosophical archetype, a symbol of the natural wisdom that lies within all human beings, waiting to be discovered and brought to light. Now, as we have seen, Anacharsis was not merely a historical figure who impressed the Greeks with his wit and wisdom. He also became a symbol, a powerful and enduring symbol of a way of life that the Greeks, for all their sophistication and learning, could not help but admire, even as they mocked it. And this symbol was the ideal of the Scythian nomad, a figure of natural virtue, uncorrupted by the refinements and the hypocrisies of civilization, and a figure who served as a mirror in which the Greeks could see their own flaws and their own excesses. The idea of the noble savage, of a people who lived in simplicity and justice, was not a new one when the Greeks encountered Anacharsis, because it had already appeared in the poetry of Homer, who described the Abi, a people of the far north, as the most just of men. And it had been repeated by later poets and historians who were fascinated by the contrast between the simple virtues of the nomads and the complex vices of the civilized world. But it was the historian Ephorus of Syme, who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, who gave this ideal its most complete and most influential expression, and he used the figure of Anacharsis as the centerpiece of his portrait of the Scythians, presenting them as a people who had achieved a kind of natural justice that the Greeks, with all their laws and their philosophy, could only envy and imitate. Ephorus, who was a student of Isocrates and who wrote a vast universal history that covered the whole known world, was not content to describe the Scythians as simple barbarians. He elevated them to the status of a model of a society that had achieved harmony and justice without the need for complex laws or elaborate institutions, because they lived a frugal life. They had no desire for wealth, and they shared everything in common, including their wives, their children, and all their property. And this communal life, which was so different from the competitive and acquisitive life of the Greeks, made them invincible, because they had nothing that they could be enslaved for, and they had no reason to fight each other, because there was nothing to fight about. This portrait, which was based on the traditional Greek image of the Scythians, was also a deliberate contrast to the Greeks themselves, because the Greeks, who were divided into warring city-states, who were obsessed with wealth and status, and who were constantly fighting among themselves, could see in the Scythians a vision of what they might have been and what they might still become if they could only learn to live more simply and more justly. And this vision, which was both a critique and an ideal, was taken up by other writers, including the Cynic philosophers, who saw in Anacharsis a model of the kind of life they were trying to promote, a life that rejected convention and embraced nature. The idealization of the Scythians, and of Anacharsis in particular, was not without its ironies, because the Greeks, who prided themselves on their civilization, were also aware of the dangers of idealizing the barbarian, and they were aware that the simplicity of the Scythians was also a kind of savagery, and that their freedom was also a kind of lawlessness, and that their justice was also a kind of harshness. And yet, despite these reservations, the image of the wise barbarian, the image of Anacharsis, continued to exert a powerful hold on the Greek imagination, because it spoke to a deep and enduring human longing, a longing for a simpler, more natural, more authentic way of life, a longing that is still with us today, in our own age of anxiety and excess. And it is a testament to the power of Anacharsis' example that his image has survived for more than 2,500 years, and that his name is still remembered as a symbol of wisdom without pretension, honesty without flattery, and courage without arrogance. Now, after all his travels, after all his conversations with the wisest men of Greece, after all his observations about the contradictions of Greek society, and after all the honors that had been bestowed upon him, including Athenian citizenship and initiation into the most sacred mysteries of the Greek religion, Anacharsis made a decision that would prove to be his last and most fateful, a decision that would bring his brilliant life to a tragic end, and this decision was to return to his homeland, to the vast steppes of Scythia, to the people among whom he had been born and raised, and to whom he had once belonged, because he was, after all, a Scythian prince, a son of the royal house. And he must have felt that, despite all his travels and all his learning, his true place was still among his own people, and that the wisdom he had acquired in Greece could be of use to his countrymen, who were still living in the old ways, without cities, without laws, and without the refinements that he had come to know and admire in the Greek world. He must have believed, as many travelers do, that he could be a bridge between two worlds, a mediator between the simple virtues of the steppes and the complex wisdom of the cities, and that he could bring back to his people the best of what he had learned, while still preserving the best of what they already had. But he was tragically mistaken, because his own people did not see him as a wise man who had returned to share his knowledge. They saw him as a traitor, a man who had been corrupted by foreign ways, and a man who had abandoned the customs and the beliefs of his ancestors. And this misunderstanding, this clash of loyalties, would lead directly to his death. The specific cause of his death, as reported by the historian Herodotus, who is our most reliable source for this event, was his participation in a religious ritual that was foreign to Scythian tradition, a ritual that involved the worship of the Mother of the Gods, a deity known in the Greek world as Cybele, and whose cult was characterized by ecstatic dancing, wild music, and the wearing of exotic garments. And this ritual, which was harmless enough in the Greek world, was seen by the Scythians as a dangerous innovation, a violation of their ancestral customs, and an act of treason against the gods of their fathers. According to Herodotus, Anacharsis, who had learned of this cult during his travels in Greece, and perhaps even during his initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, had become fascinated by it, and he had promised his brother Solus, who had become king in his absence, that he would not introduce any foreign customs into Scythia, but when he returned to his homeland, he could not resist the temptation to perform the rites of the Great Mother, and he did so secretly, at night, wearing the ritual garments and carrying the sacred drum, in a place called Hylia, which was a wooded area near the racecourse of Achilles, in the lower reaches of the Dnieper or the Don, and it was there that he was discovered and killed by his own brother, who struck him down with an arrow, ending his life and his dream of reconciling the two worlds that he had tried so hard to understand. Now, as if the story of his death were not tragic enough, there exists another version, one that is less dramatic, but perhaps even more revealing about the tensions that Anacharsis experienced in his final days. And this version, which is reported by some ancient authors, does not speak of a secret religious ritual performed at night, but rather of a more open and more deliberate attempt to change the very fabric of Scythian society, an attempt to introduce the laws and the customs of the Greeks into the land of his fathers. According to this version, Anacharsis, who had been so impressed by the laws and the institutions of the Greeks, and who had seen how they could create order and justice in the cities of Hellas, returned to Scythia with a burning desire to reform his own people, to bring them out of their nomadic existence and into a more settled and more civilized way of life. And he began to advocate for the adoption of Greek laws, Greek customs, and even Greek religion, and this advocacy, which must have seemed to him a noble and enlightened endeavor, was seen by his fellow Scythians as a betrayal of everything they held dear, as an attempt to destroy their ancient traditions, to undermine their freedom, and to turn them into slaves of foreign ideas. And they could not forgive him for this betrayal, because they saw in his enthusiasm for Greek ways a rejection of their own way of life, a way of life that had sustained them for generations, and which they believed was superior to the soft and decadent life of the cities. This version of his death is not as well documented as the one reported by Herodotus, and it may be a later invention, a way of explaining the conflict between Anacharsis and his people in terms that were more familiar to Greek readers, who were used to thinking of the Scythians as simple barbarians who could not appreciate the benefits of civilization. But it is still a valuable reminder of the difficulties that face any reformer, any man who tries to change the customs of his people, and who finds that his own people are not ready for the changes he wants to bring. Among all the versions of Anacharsis' death, there is one that stands out not for its drama or its horror, but for its bitter and penetrating insight into the human condition, and this version, which is preserved for us by the biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era and who collected the lives of the Greek philosophers, tells us that Anacharsis was killed by his brother, not during a religious ritual performed in the dead of night, nor during a political struggle over the introduction of foreign laws, but during something as ordinary and as mundane as a hunt, and that as he lay dying, pierced by the arrow of his own brother, he spoke the words that would echo through the ages, words that reveal the tragic irony of his life. My reputation saved me in Greece, but the envy which it caused on my native soil destroyed me. This version, which may be more philosophical than historical, is a powerful meditation on the nature of fame and the dangers of success, because Anacharsis had become famous in Greece for his wisdom, and this fame had brought him honor and respect, and even citizenship. But when he returned to Scythia, the same fame, the same reputation that had made him a hero in Athens, made him a target in his own homeland, because his people, who had never left the steppes, who had never seen the wonders of the Greek world, could not understand what he had done to earn such honor, and they suspected him of having become a foreigner, a traitor, a man who had abandoned his own people for the sake of foreign glory, and this suspicion, this envy, this resentment, was what ultimately killed him. Modern historians, who are not content with the simple explanations offered by ancient sources, and who are always looking for more complex and more realistic interpretations of historical events, have suggested that the real cause of Anacharsis' death may have been not religious zeal or cultural envy, but something much more mundane and much more practical, namely politics. And they point out that Anacharsis was not just a wise man, but a prince, a member of the royal family, and a potential rival to his brother Solus, who was the reigning king of Scythia, and they suggest that Solus, who may have seen Anacharsis as a threat to his throne, used the incident with the religious ritual as a pretext to get rid of a dangerous rival, and that the real reason for his death was the fear that he would return to Scythia and attempt to seize power, or that he would use his influence with the Greeks to undermine the authority of the king. And this political interpretation, which is plausible and which fits the pattern of many royal assassinations in history, has the advantage of being more realistic and more cynical than the religious explanation, because it does not rely on the belief that the Scythians were motivated by simple piety or simple envy, but assumes that they were capable of the same kind of political calculation that we see in any other society. Among all the versions of Anacharsis' death, there is one that stands out not for its drama or its horror, but for its bitter and penetrating insight into the human condition, and this version, which is preserved for us by the biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era and who collected the lives of the Greek philosophers, tells us that Anacharsis was killed by his brother, not during a religious ritual performed in the dead of night, nor during a political struggle over the introduction of foreign laws, but during something as ordinary and as mundane as a hunt, and that as he lay dying, pierced by the arrow of his own brother, he spoke the words that would echo through the ages, words that reveal the tragic irony of his life. My reputation saved me in Greece, but the envy which it caused on my native soil destroyed me. This version, which may be more philosophical than historical, is a powerful meditation on the nature of fame and the dangers of success, because Anacharsis had become famous in Greece for his wisdom, and this fame had brought him honor and respect, and even citizenship. But when he returned to Scythia, the same fame, the same reputation that had made him a hero in Athens, made him a target in his own homeland, because his people, who had never left the steppes, who had never seen the wonders of the Greek world, could not understand what he had done to earn such honor, and they suspected him of having become a foreigner, a traitor, a man who had abandoned his own people for the sake of foreign glory, and this suspicion, this envy, this resentment, was what ultimately killed him. Modern historians, who are not content with the simple explanations offered by ancient sources, and who are always looking for more complex and more realistic interpretations of historical events, have suggested that the real cause of Anacharsis' death may have been not religious zeal or cultural envy, but something much more mundane and much more practical, namely politics. And they point out that Anacharsis was not just a wise man, but a prince, a member of the royal family, and a potential rival to his brother Solon, who was the reigning king of Scythia, and they suggest that Solon, who may have seen Anacharsis as a threat to his throne, used the incident with the religious ritual as a pretext to get rid of a dangerous rival, and that the real reason for his death was the fear that he would return to Scythia and attempt to seize power, or that he would use his influence with the Greeks to undermine the authority of the king. And this political interpretation, which is plausible and which fits the pattern of many royal assassinations in history, has the advantage of being more realistic and more cynical than the religious explanation, because it does not rely on the belief that the Scythians were motivated by simple piety or simple envy, but assumes that they were capable of the same kind of political calculation that we see in any other society. It is also possible that the cause of the conflict was not political, but economic, because Anacharsis, with his contacts in the Greek world, might have been involved in trade, and his control over certain trade routes or his influence over certain trading partners might have threatened the interests of other Scythian nobles, who saw him as a competitor and who wanted to eliminate him. And this economic interpretation, which is also plausible, adds another layer of complexity to the story, and reminds us that the lives of historical figures are rarely determined by single causes, but are the product of many different and often competing interests. Now, after all the stories, all the legends, all the contradictory versions of his life and death, we must finally ask the question that has been lurking in the background of this entire narrative. Did Anacharsis actually exist, or is he simply a myth, a figure invented by the Greeks to illustrate their ideas about the wisdom of the barbarians? A literary device that was used by philosophers and historians to criticize their own society, but who never walked the earth as a real man of flesh and blood? This question, which is a legitimate one, because many figures of the ancient world are more legend than history, has been answered by modern scholarship with a cautious but confident affirmative, because most scholars who have studied the evidence agree that Anacharsis was a real historical figure, a Scythian prince who really did travel to Greece, who really did meet Solon, and who really did die a violent death at the hands of his own people. And this conclusion is based not on the romantic stories of the philosophers, but on the hard, tangible evidence of archaeology, which has provided us with a concrete link to the world of the 6th century before the Common Era, a link that bears the name of Anacharsis and that confirms his existence beyond any reasonable doubt. In the city of Olbia, which was a Greek colony on the northern coast of the Black Sea, near the mouth of the Dnieper River, archaeologists discovered a stone inscription dating from the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, and on this inscription, which was a dedication to the god Apollo Boreas, the god of the north wind, the name of a certain Anacharsis, the son of Anacharsis, is recorded in this name. Anacharsis is clearly a Greek rendering of a Scythian name, and the father's name, Anacharsis, is almost certainly a variant of Anacharsis, which means that the man who dedicated this offering to Apollo was very likely the son of the famous Scythian prince, a son whose existence had not been recorded in any literary source, but whose presence in the archaeological record confirms that Anacharsis was not a mythical figure, but a real man who had a family and a lineage, and who left behind descendants who continued to live in the Greek colonies of the Black Sea. This inscription, which is a small and unremarkable piece of stone, is thus a powerful piece of evidence, because it links the name of Anacharsis to a specific place and a specific time, and it shows that he was known not only in Athens and in Sardis, but also in the Greek colonies of the Black Sea, which were the main points of contact between the Greek world and the Scythian world, and that his memory was preserved not just by philosophers and historians, but by his own family, who continued to honor him even after his death. This archaeological discovery is important for two reasons. First, because it confirms the historicity of Anacharsis, and second, because it reveals a detail that the literary sources had not preserved, namely that he had a son, and that his son, who was probably raised in a Greek colony, continued to bear his father's name and to honor his memory. And this discovery, which is a small but valuable addition to our knowledge of the ancient world, also reminds us of the importance of archaeology for understanding the past, because without the discovery of that inscription, we would have only the stories of the poets and the philosophers to rely on, and those stories, however beautiful and however inspiring, are not always reliable guides to historical truth. And when we think about the son of Anacharsis, a man whose name is preserved only on a stone in the ruins of Olbia, we can imagine him as a man who grew up in two worlds, the world of his Scythian father and the world of his Greek mother. And we can imagine him looking back at the tragic fate of his father and wondering what it all meant. And we can imagine him honoring his father's memory with a simple offering to the god of the north wind, an offering that would survive for 2,500 years, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists and to reveal to us the truth about the wise barbarian who had become a legend. Now, as we have seen, Anacharsis was not only a man of action, a traveler, a diplomat, and a critic of Greek society. He was also a man of letters, a writer who committed his thoughts and his observations to writing, and the ancient sources tell us that he composed a poem of about 800 or 900 verses, in which he compared the laws and the customs of the Scythians with those of the Greeks, and in which he reflected on the nature of the simple life, on the art of warfare, and on the principles of justice that should govern human society, and this poem, which has not survived to the present day, must have been a remarkable work, because it was written by a man who had seen both worlds, who had lived in the steppes and in the cities, and who had spoken with the wisest men of his time, and it must have been a work that challenged the assumptions of the Greeks, because it showed that a barbarian could write poetry, and that a man from the steppes could reflect on the nature of laws and justice with as much depth and insight as any Greek philosopher. According to Diogenes Laertius, who is our most reliable source for this information, Anacharsis wrote a poem of about 800 lines, in which he dealt with the institutions of the Greeks and the Scythians, dealing with simplicity of life and military matters. And this poem was written in verse, not in prose, because in the 6th century before the Common Era, the distinction between poetry and prose was not as clear as it would become later, and many of the earliest Greek philosophers, including Parmenides and Empedocles, wrote their ideas in verse, because verse was considered more memorable, more dignified, and more suitable for conveying important truths than prose, and it is likely that Anacharsis, who had been educated by his Greek mother and who had absorbed the Greek tradition of poetry, chose this form for his own work. The content of the poem, as far as we can reconstruct it from the fragments and the references that have survived, was a comparison of the customs of the Scythians and the Greeks, and a defense of the Scythian way of life against the criticisms of the Greeks. And it must have been a work that emphasized the simplicity and the natural virtue of the Scythians, who lived without cities and without written laws, and who relied on their own courage and their own sense of honor to guide their actions, while the Greeks, who had all the refinements of civilization, were often corrupted by their own sophistication. Anacharsis, who had seen the hypocrisy of the Athenians, who had watched the athletes bruising each other in the gymnasium, and who had observed the merchants lying in the marketplace, must have used his poem to point out the contradictions in Greek culture and to argue that the simple life of the steppes, for all its roughness, was in many ways superior to the complex and often corrupt life of the city. And this argument, which was the same argument that he had made in his conversations with Solon and with the other Greek philosophers, must have been a powerful and unsettling critique of Greek civilization. The poem, which is now lost to us, must have contained many of the same ideas that we have encountered in his sayings, but it would have presented them in a more systematic and more developed form, and it would have given us a much fuller and much richer picture of his thought than the few fragments that have survived. This poem, which was a written monument to Scythian wisdom, was also a testament to Anacharsis' education and his cultural hybridity, because he was a Scythian who wrote in Greek, and he was a prince who wrote about the customs of his people, and he was a man who had traveled to the ends of the known world and who had absorbed the best of both cultures. And he must have hoped that his poem would be read by the Greeks and the Scythians alike, and that it would serve as a bridge between the two worlds, and as a reminder that wisdom was not the exclusive property of any one nation, but was a universal human quality that could be found wherever men lived with courage and honesty. When we think about Anacharsis writing his poem of 800 verses in the Greek language, in the metrical form that he had learned from his mother, and when we think about him trying to explain his own people and his own culture to the Greeks, and trying to explain the Greeks to his own people, we must imagine him as a man who was trapped between two worlds, a man who could never fully belong to either, but who, through his writing, attempted to create a space where the two worlds could meet and understand each other. And this effort, which was both noble and tragic, is perhaps his greatest legacy, because it shows that even a wise man, even a man who had seen the best and the worst of two cultures, could not escape the fate of the outsider, but could only try to make sense of it through the power of his words. Now, as we have seen, Anacharsis was not only a poet and a philosopher, but also a speaker, a man whose blunt, unpolished, and often startlingly direct speech made a deep impression on everyone who heard him. And this style of speaking, which was so different from the polished and sophisticated rhetoric of the Greek orators, became known as Scythian eloquence, and it was both admired and feared, because it was a style that did not flatter, did not deceive, and did not attempt to hide the truth behind a veil of elegant words, but spoke directly to the heart of the matter, with a simplicity and a clarity that were often more persuasive than the most elaborate speeches. The Greeks, who were masters of rhetoric, who had developed the art of persuasion to a high degree, and who believed that the ability to speak well was one of the highest marks of civilization, were both fascinated and unsettled by the bluntness of Anacharsis, because they could not deny the power of his words, even when they were uncomfortable, and they could not help but admire a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, without any of the usual evasions and deceptions that characterized much of Greek political life. This Scythian eloquence became a byword for a kind of speech that was not learned in the schools of rhetoric, but was born of a life of honesty and simplicity, and it was used by later Greek writers, such as the Cynics, who admired the directness of Anacharsis and who sought to imitate his style, and it was also used by those who wanted to criticize the hypocrisy of Greek political discourse, and who saw in Anacharsis a model of how to speak truth to power. One of the most famous sayings attributed to Anacharsis, and one that has become almost proverbial in its own right, is the phrase that echoes the famous words of Bias of Prene, another of the Seven Sages, who was said to have declared, "All that I have I carry with me," and which Anacharsis is said to have repeated in a similar form, though in his case, the words must have had a slightly different meaning, because for Bias, who was a Greek and a lawyer, the phrase was a statement about the superiority of wisdom over material wealth, a reminder that the only things that truly belong to us are the things we carry in our souls. But for Anacharsis, who was a Scythian, a nomad, a man who had grown up without cities and without possessions, the phrase must have had a more literal meaning, because he had never owned much, and he had never felt the need to own much. And he had always known that the only true wealth is the wealth of freedom, the wealth of the open steppe, and the wealth of a clear and honest mind. Whether Anacharsis actually said these words, or whether they were later attributed to him because of his reputation as a wise barbarian, the phrase has become associated with his name, and it captures something essential about his character, his independence, his simplicity, and his refusal to be tied down by the things that most people value. Now, among all the sayings attributed to Anacharsis, there is one that stands out not only for its wit, but also for its practical wisdom, and that is his observation about the vine, that it produces three kinds of grapes, each corresponding to a different stage of intoxication, and each with its own lesson for the drinker, because he said that the first grape brings pleasure, the second brings intoxication, and the third brings disgust. And this saying, which has survived through the centuries, is a perfect example of his ability to express profound truths in simple, vivid, and unforgettable images, and it is also a reflection of his deep understanding of the dangers of alcohol, a danger that he had observed not only among the Greeks, but also among his own people, the Scythians, who were famous for their heavy drinking and for their belief that drunkenness was a sign of strength, but who also knew that it could lead to shame and ruin. Anacharsis, who had seen the effects of excessive drinking on both sides, knew that wine was not inherently evil, but that it had to be used with caution, and that the difference between pleasure and pain, between conviviality and regret, often lay in the ability to stop before it was too late. And this wisdom, which is as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago, is a reminder that the ancient Greeks and their neighbors were not so different from us, and that the same pleasures and the same dangers that we face today were already well known to the wise men of antiquity. Now, it is interesting to note that Anacharsis was not the only sage who concerned himself with the dangers of drinking, because another of the seven sages, the famous Pittacus of Mytilene, who lived on the island of Lesbos, which was also famous for its wine, had also grappled with this problem, and he had come up with a remarkable solution. He had enacted a law that doubled the punishment for any crime committed while under the influence of alcohol, because he reasoned that a man who chose to drink to excess and then commit a crime was doubly guilty, since he had voluntarily put himself in a state where he could not control his actions, and he wanted to make sure that the nobles, who were often the worst offenders, would think twice before they drank themselves into a frenzy and then went on rampages through the streets of Mytilene. This law, which was so innovative and so effective that it became famous throughout Greece, was a clear recognition of the fact that wine, especially the strong, sweet wines of Lesbos and other islands, could be a source of social disorder if it was not consumed with moderation, and that it was the duty of the lawgiver to protect the community from the excesses of those who could not control themselves. And it is striking that both Pittacus and Anacharsis, two of the seven sages, one a Greek and one a Scythian, should have been so concerned with the same problem, and that they should have found similar ways to address it. The wines of the 6th century before the Common Era were not the light, watered-down beverages that we might imagine, but powerful, often sweet and heavily perfumed drinks that could easily intoxicate even the most experienced drinker. And the most famous of these wines came from the islands of the Aegean, especially Chios, which was known for its white wine, a wine that was said to be so smooth and so fragrant that it was exported all over the Mediterranean and was drunk by kings and nobles. And Lesbos, which produced a strong, dark, resinous wine that was also highly prized, and the wines of Thasos, of Kos, and of Rhodes were also famous, and they were all traded across the sea, bringing wealth and renown to the cities that produced them. The Greeks, who were not foolish, usually drank their wine mixed with water, often in a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or even more water than that, so that they could enjoy the taste and the conviviality of wine without losing control of themselves. And this practice, which was considered a mark of civilization, was contrasted with the behavior of the barbarians, who were said to drink their wine neat, and who were therefore more prone to drunkenness and violence. And it is interesting to think that Anacharsis, who was a Scythian, had probably grown up drinking wine in the Scythian fashion, but that he had also observed the Greek custom of mixing wine with water, and that he had come to appreciate its wisdom. All of this context makes Anacharsis' sayings about wine even more meaningful, because they show that he was not simply a moralist who condemned pleasure, but a realist who understood that wine, like fire, was a good servant but a bad master, and that the key to using it well was to know one's limits and to be aware of the consequences of excess. And his 3 grapes, the grape of pleasure, the grape of intoxication, and the grape of disgust, are a perfect summary of this wisdom, a wisdom that, was shared by the Greeks and the barbarians alike, and that is still as relevant today as it was when Anacharsis uttered it, more than 2,500 years ago. Now, among the many paradoxes and sharp observations that were attributed to Anacharsis, there is one group of sayings that stands out not for its wit alone, but for the practical wisdom it reveals, and these sayings are about the sea, about the fragility of human life, and about the strange things that people value, and they show us a man who had crossed the sea and survived, and who had learned to see it with the clear eyes of a man who had grown up on the solid earth of the steppes. And the first of these is his remark about the thickness of a ship's planks, which, as he observed, was only 4 fingers, and the passengers were therefore exactly that distance from death. And this observation, which is both a joke and a profound meditation on the nature of risk, has survived because it captures a truth that everyone who has ever sailed has felt, the truth that the sea is indifferent to our courage and our skill, and that the difference between life and death can be as thin as a wooden plank. Another of his sayings is about safety itself, because when he was asked what kind of vessels were the safest, he replied, without hesitation, that the safest vessels were those that had been pulled ashore, and this answer, which is both witty and true, shows that he understood that the only way to be truly safe is to avoid danger altogether, and that the wise man does not trust his life to the mercy of the waves, but keeps his feet on dry land whenever he can, and this is a lesson that is as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. Now, this practical understanding of the sea and its dangers may have had something to do with the fact that Anacharsis was credited, in Antiquity, with the invention of the anchor, not the very first anchor, which had existed in various forms since the beginning of seafaring, but the 2-fluked anchor, the anchor with 2 teeth, or flukes, which could dig into the seabed and hold a ship fast in a storm, and which was a great improvement over the earlier anchors, which were simply heavy stones, or bags of sand that held the ship only by their weight. According to the geographer Strabo, who was writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, Anacharsis was the inventor of the anchor with 2 teeth, and this claim is also found in the Suda, the Byzantine encyclopedia, which states that Anacharsis, the Scythian philosopher, invented the anchor and the potter's wheel, and that he lived in the time of Croesus. Pliny, the Roman naturalist, gives the credit for the invention to Eupalymus, but he says that the improvement, the addition of the 2nd fluke, was made by Anacharsis. The historian Ephorus, whose works are lost but are quoted by later writers, credited Anacharsis with not 1 but 3 inventions: the bellows, the 2-fluked anchor, and the potter's wheel. This attribution is remarkable because it shows that the Greeks, for all their pride in their own civilization, were willing to admit that a barbarian, a man from the steppes, could be a skilled craftsman and a useful inventor. And it also shows that Anacharsis' reputation for wisdom was not limited to his sayings and his philosophy, but also extended to his practical skills, his ability to make things that worked. The potter's wheel, which was also attributed to him by Ephorus and others, was another important invention because it allowed potters to make vessels more quickly and more uniformly than they could by hand, and it was a device that was essential for the development of trade and commerce. The ancient hematographers, as the scholars of the Hellenistic period were called, loved to argue about who had invented what, and they were not always in agreement. But the fact that Anacharsis' name was mentioned in these discussions is itself a testimony to his reputation. Plato himself, in his Dialogue Republic, mentions Anacharsis as a wise man and an inventor, and this is the earliest known reference to his inventive powers, which means that already in the 4th century before the Common Era, the idea that Anacharsis had made useful things was well established. The Suda, in its entry, also confirms that he was credited with the anchor and the potter's wheel, adding that this was known and accepted in the tradition. Now, a practical question arises when we consider that Anacharsis was a prince who traveled extensively, lived in Greece for a long time, and engaged in philosophical conversations, which suggests that he had some means of support. And the question is, where did the money come from? One possibility is that, as a prince, he had access to the resources of the Scythian royal family, and he could draw on them for his travels. And this would have been the easiest and most natural explanation, because in the ancient world, kings and their relatives did not need to work for a living, and they could support themselves and their retinues from the wealth of their kingdoms. Another possibility is that he used his Scythian connections to engage in trade, because the Scythians were known to the Greeks primarily as traders, supplying grain, furs, gold, and slaves to the Greek colonies on the Black Sea, and a Scythian prince who could speak both languages and who had a reputation for intelligence would have been ideally placed to act as a middleman, a broker, or a commissioner of trade. The Greek colonies, such as Olbia, were commercial centers, and their wealth depended on their ability to trade with the Scythian hinterland. So an ambassador from the Scythian king would have been a welcome and important figure, and he would have been entertained and supported by the Greek cities as a matter of state policy. It is also worth considering that Anacharsis was not just a visitor, but a guest of Solon, who was a man of considerable wealth and status, and he would have been treated with the hospitality that was due to a prince, and this hospitality would have included food, shelter, and perhaps even a stipend, which was a common practice in the ancient world, when the exchange of gifts and favors was an important part of diplomacy and social relations. He was also granted Athenian citizenship, an honor that was usually reserved for those who had rendered significant services to the city, and it may be that this honor was accompanied by a financial grant or some other form of support, though the sources are silent on this point. The most likely explanation, therefore, is that he had a combination of resources. His Scythian connections gave him access to a flow of gifts and favors. His diplomacy gave him status and a reason to be supported by the cities he visited, and his reputation gave him invitations to the houses of the rich and powerful, where he could live in comfort and style. And this combination, which was typical of the wandering wise men of antiquity, would have been enough to sustain him during his long travels through the Greek world. Now, among the many inventions and improvements that were attributed to Anacharsis, there is one more that deserves our attention, because it concerns not the safety of the ship in a storm, but the speed and efficiency of its movement through the water, and that is the improvement of the sail, which according to some ancient sources, he was also credited with. And this attribution, which is reported in the Suda and in other late sources, shows that his reputation as a practical inventor was not limited to the anchor and the potter's wheel, but extended to the very means by which ships moved across the sea. And it suggests that he understood not only how to stop a ship, but also how to make it go faster and how to make it more responsive to the wind. And this understanding, which would have been essential for any long-distance traveler, was probably born of his own experience of sailing the Aegean and the Black Sea, and of his observation of the ships that plied these waters. The improvement of the sail, which may have been a simple matter of changing the shape or the angle of the sail, or of adding a second sail to increase speed, would have been a significant contribution to the technology of the time, because it would have allowed ships to sail more efficiently, to make better use of the wind, and to arrive at their destinations more quickly and more safely. And it would have been especially useful for the long voyages that the Greeks made from their home ports to the colonies on the Black Sea, a voyage that could take many days and that was subject to the vagaries of the wind and the weather. But before we can fully appreciate the significance of the inventions that were attributed to Anacharsis, we must understand the context in which they were made. And that context is the world of ancient seafaring, a world in which the Greeks, who were not yet the great ocean navigators they would later become, sailed mainly along the coasts, in a type of navigation that is called cabotage, a term that comes from the French word caboter, meaning to sail from cape to cape, or from headland to headland. And this was the standard way of traveling in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea for most of the ancient period, because it allowed sailors to stay close to the shore, to find shelter in case of storms, to replenish their supplies of water and food, and to avoid the dangers of the open sea, where the winds were unpredictable, the currents were strong, and the risk of shipwreck was much greater. The Greeks, who were not yet the masters of the open ocean, relied on this coastal navigation for all their trading and their travel, and their ships, which were relatively small, with a single mast and a single square sail, and which were also equipped with oars, which could be used when the wind was unfavorable or when the ship was entering a harbor, were designed for this type of sailing. And they were not suited for long ocean voyages or for sailing in heavy seas. The typical Greek ship of the 6th century before the Common Era would have been a cargo vessel, perhaps a merchant ship called a halkaz, or a military vessel, such as a penteconter, which had 50 oars and was used for raiding and for warfare. But it would not have been a large ship, and it would not have been able to carry a large amount of cargo, because the hold was often open to the elements, and the cargo had to be protected from the rain and the spray, and the ship would have been difficult to handle in rough weather, and it would have had to put into port whenever the wind turned against it, and it would have had to wait for days or even weeks for the right wind to continue its journey. The Scythians, who lived on the northern shore of the Black Sea, were not a seafaring people in the same way as the Greeks, because they did not build large ships, and they did not sail far from the coast, but they did have small boats and rafts, which they used for fishing and for crossing rivers, and they also used animal skins inflated with air, which they used as floats, and they were familiar with the sea, and they were not afraid of it. But they did not venture far from the shore, and they did not engage in long-distance trade by sea as the Greeks did, because their wealth came from the land, from their herds of horses and cattle, from their grain and their gold, and they traded these goods with the Greeks, who came to them by sea, and who brought them wine, olive oil, and other luxury goods in exchange. The Scythians, in fact, were often portrayed by the Greeks as a people who were afraid of the sea, because they had no word for it in their language, and they regarded it as a kind of liquid desert, a place that was hostile to human life, and they preferred to stay on dry land, where they could feel the solid earth beneath their feet, and they were suspicious of anyone who tried to cross the water, because they believed that the sea was a barrier that had been created by the gods to keep people apart. This contrast between the Greeks, who were a seafaring people, and the Scythians, who were a land-based people, is important for understanding the story of Anacharsis, because he was a man who had crossed the sea, who had traveled from the land of the Scythians to the land of the Greeks, and who had, in effect, broken the barrier that separated the two worlds. And this act of crossing, of leaving the solid earth and trusting himself to the waves, was a symbol of his willingness to embrace change, to learn from others, and to see the world from a different perspective, and it was this act that made him such a remarkable figure. And it is perhaps not surprising that the same man who had crossed the sea should have been credited with the invention of the anchor, the improvement of the sail, and the potter's wheel, because he was a man who understood the importance of practical skills, who saw that wisdom was not only a matter of words, but also of things, and who knew that the best way to prove the value of one's ideas was to build something that worked, and that could be used by others. Now, after his tragic death, Anacharsis did not simply fade into the shadows of history. His name, his wit, and his paradoxical wisdom continued to echo through the corridors of Greek literature for centuries, because he had become more than just a man. He had become a symbol, a figure of the wise barbarian, who could be used by later writers to critique their own societies, to question their own assumptions, and to explore the nature of wisdom and civilization. We have already spoken in this narrative about the collection of 10 letters that were attributed to him, those famous letters of Anacharsis, composed by Cynic philosophers in the 3rd century before the Common Era, which used his voice to express their ideals of simplicity and self-sufficiency, and which have survived to this day as a testament to his enduring influence. But the literary afterlife of Anacharsis extended far beyond these letters, because he was also a character in the works of some of the greatest writers of the ancient world, writers who saw in him a figure that could illuminate their own ideas and their own concerns, and who used his story to explore the tensions and the contradictions of their own cultures. One of the most significant of these writers was Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and who was fascinated by the figure of the Scythian prince, because he wrote not one, but 2 works about him, a dialogue entitled Anacharsis, or on athletics, and a shorter piece called the Scythian. In the first of these works, Lucian imagines a conversation between Anacharsis and Solon, in which the Scythian questions the Greek practice of athletic competitions, wondering why the Greeks honor men who bruise and bloody each other in the gymnasium, and Solon explains the purpose of physical training in Greek education. And this dialogue, which is both a defense of Greek culture and a critique of it, is a testament to the enduring fascination with the contrast between the Greek and the barbarian, and it shows that even in the 2nd century, Anacharsis could still serve as a vehicle for exploring the tensions and the contradictions of Greek civilization. In the second work, the Scythian, Lucian tells the story of Anacharsis' arrival in Athens, his meeting with the Scythian Toxaris, and his introduction to Solon, and he uses this narrative to explore themes of cultural encounter, friendship, and the search for wisdom. Lucian, who was himself a Syrian by birth and who often felt like an outsider in the Greek world, may have seen in Anacharsis a kindred spirit, a man who was also an outsider, who had also crossed cultural boundaries, and who had also struggled to find his place in a world that was not his own. Anacharsis also appears in the writings of the Roman philosopher Cicero, who mentions him in his Tusculan Disputations, and he is quoted by the biographer Diogenes Laertius in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, who preserved many of his sayings and gave us the most detailed account of his life. He is referred to by the historian Herodotus, who is the earliest source for his story, and by Plutarch, who includes him in his list of the 7 sages, and even Plato, the greatest of the Greek philosophers, mentions him in his dialogue Republic as an inventor and a wise man. Each of these authors, in his own way, contributed to the construction of the Anacharsis legend, selecting and shaping the material to suit his own purposes, and in doing so, they ensured that his name would not be forgotten, and that his story would continue to be told for generations to come. These literary echoes of Anacharsis are a testament to the power of his example and to the universal appeal of a man who dared to question the assumptions of his time and who proved that wisdom is not a possession of any one nation, but a quality that can be found anywhere, in any person, regardless of their origin or their culture. Now, as we have seen, the legacy of Anacharsis did not end with the Greek and Roman philosophers, because his name and his reputation continued to echo through the centuries and even reached the ears of the early Christian apologists, who were engaged in a fierce intellectual struggle with the pagan world and who were constantly searching for arguments and examples that could support their claims and persuade their opponents. And one of these apologists was Tertullian, a brilliant and controversial writer who lived in Carthage in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and who used the example of Anacharsis in his defense of Christianity against its pagan critics. In his famous work, The Apology, which was addressed to the Roman authorities and to the educated public of the empire, Tertullian mentions Anacharsis as an argument against the prejudice and ignorance that he saw among those who condemned Christianity without knowing anything about it. And he quotes the saying of the Scythian prince about the ignorant judging the expert. And he implies that the critics of Christianity, like those who mocked Anacharsis, were judging something they did not understand, and that their prejudice was based on ignorance and fear, not on knowledge and reason. In this context, Anacharsis becomes a symbol of the wise outsider who is rejected by those who are too narrow-minded to appreciate his wisdom, and Tertullian uses him to show that the truth is often found among those who are despised and rejected by the powerful and the learned. Tertullian also mentions Anacharsis in another of his works, a treatise called On the Pallium, which is a defense of the simple, unadorned garment that Christians wore, and which he contrasts with the elaborate and expensive clothing of the pagan world. And in this work, he again appeals to the example of the Scythian prince, who was known for his simple dress and his rejection of luxury, and who, according to the tradition, wore a simple Scythian cloak, which was a symbol of his independence and his freedom from the corrupting influences of civilization. For Tertullian, Anacharsis was not just a historical figure, but a model of the kind of simplicity and moral integrity that he believed Christians should emulate, and he used his example to criticize the vanity and the excesses of the Roman world, and to argue that true wisdom is not a matter of fine clothes or sophisticated rhetoric, but of inner purity and moral courage. This is a fascinating connection because it shows that the image of Anacharsis, which had begun as a figure of the wise barbarian in Greek philosophy, had been taken up by Christian writers and transformed into a symbol of the ascetic and the moral reformer, a figure who could be used to critique the decadence of the pagan world and to promote the values of simplicity and self-discipline that the Christians held dear. And if you are intrigued by the figure of Tertullian and by his complex and often contradictory relationship with Greek philosophy, we have a separate video on our channel that explores his life and his thought in much greater detail, where we discuss his famous phrase, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" and his paradoxical embrace of the very culture he so often criticized, and where we trace the influence of his ideas on the development of Christian theology and Western philosophy as a whole. And we invite you to watch that video to deepen your understanding of this fascinating and controversial thinker. But the Christian echo of Anacharsis does not end with Tertullian, because we must also travel forward in time, to the late 17th century, and to a place that may seem very far from the steppes of Scythia or the streets of Athens, and that is the city of Moscow, in Russia, where, in the Novospassky Monastery, a remarkable fresco was created, which depicted Anacharsis alongside other great figures of the ancient world, including Plato, Aristotle, Solon, Homer, and Orpheus, at the entrance to the monastery. And this fresco, which was painted by the Russian artist Fyodor Zubov, was not a simple decoration, but a deliberate theological statement, because it was intended to show that the wisdom of the ancient philosophers and poets was not incompatible with Christianity, but was, in fact, a preparation for it, a kind of divine pedagogy that had led the human race towards the truth that was fully revealed in Christ. In this fresco, Anacharsis stands among the greatest minds of the ancient world, not as a foreigner or a barbarian, but as a fellow seeker after truth, a man who had grasped something of the divine wisdom, and who, by his example, had shown the way to those who came after him. And this brings us to a broader tradition that was common in the Christian East and West, the tradition of placing images of ancient philosophers and sages in the narthex, that is, the entrance hall or the vestibule of the church, the place where the faithful would gather before entering the main body of the temple, and where they would be reminded that the journey to the divine truth begins with the wisdom that is available to all people, regardless of their faith or their culture. This tradition, which can be seen in many medieval churches, both in the Byzantine world and in the Latin West, was a visual expression of the belief that the Greek philosophers, the Roman poets, and the prophets of the Old Testament were all part of the same divine plan, and that they had all contributed, each in his own way, to the preparation of the human race for the coming of Christ. One of the most famous examples of this tradition is the depiction of the ancient poets and philosophers in the cathedral of the town of Bulgar, in Tatarstan, which was built in the 13th century, and where the images of Homer, Plato, and other sages can be seen in the narthex. And another is the representation of the pagan poets and philosophers in the Italian churches of the Renaissance, who were often shown as precursors of the Christian message, as men who had glimpsed the truth, even if they had not fully understood it. It is also worth recalling that in Dante's Divine Comedy, the great Italian poet placed his own guide, the Roman poet Virgil, in limbo, the first circle of hell, which was reserved for the virtuous pagans who had lived before the coming of Christ, and who, though they were not saved, were not punished, because they had lived honorable lives and had sought the truth with all their hearts. This image, which is both surprising and moving, is a testament to the enduring power of the Anacharsis legend, and to its ability to adapt to new contexts and new cultures, because it shows that even in a Christian monastery, in a country far from the Greek world, the Scythian prince could still be honored as a precursor of the truth, a man who had seen the light, and who had pointed the way to others. And it also shows that the Greeks were not the only ones who could claim Anacharsis as their own, because the Christians, too, saw in him a figure of wisdom and virtue, a man who could be used to bridge the gap between the pagan past and the Christian present. Now, as the centuries passed and the name of the Scythian prince continued to echo through the corridors of literature, philosophy, and even theology, another chapter was added to the long and varied legacy of Anacharsis, one that would have a profound impact on the cultural and political life of Europe, and that would help to shape the modern understanding of ancient Greece. And this chapter was written not by a Greek, or a Roman, or even a Christian, but by a French abbot, a man who lived in a different age, an age of reason and revolution, an age that was fascinated by the ancient world and that sought to learn from its example. His name was Jean-Jacques Barthélemy. and he was a scholar of remarkable erudition, a numismatist, a linguist, a member of the French Academy, and a man who, like Anacharsis himself, had a deep love for the Greek world and a desire to make it known to others. And in the year 1788, he published a book that would change the way Europeans thought about Greece. And that would make the name of Anacharsis famous once again, in a context that was entirely new and entirely unexpected. The book was called The Travels of the Young Anacharsis in Greece, and it was a work of fiction, a novel, but it was also a work of immense scholarship, and it was written in the form of a travel diary, a narrative of the journey of a young Scythian, who was a descendant of the famous philosopher, through the cities and islands of Greece in the 4th century before the Common Era, just before the time of Alexander the Great, and who, through his eyes and his observations, gave the reader a vivid and comprehensive portrait of Greek life, Greek culture, Greek politics, and Greek thought. Bartholomew's book was not a historical novel in the modern sense, because it did not focus on a single dramatic story, but rather it was a kind of encyclopedia, a systematic and meticulously researched account of every aspect of ancient Greek civilization, from its laws and its government to its religion and its philosophy, from its art and its architecture to its music and its poetry. And it was written with such authority and such attention to detail that it quickly became the standard work on the subject for educated Europeans. The hero of the book, the young Anacharsis, was not a new character, but an old one, a descendant of the Scythian prince whose life we have been following. But Bartholomew used him as a device, a way of presenting the vast and complex world of ancient Greece to the reader in a form that was accessible and engaging, and the device worked beautifully because the book was a huge success, selling thousands of copies and being translated into many languages, including English, German, Spanish, Italian, and even Armenian. It was read by ordinary people and by kings, by students and by scholars, and it played a major role in the development of the movement known as Philhellenism, the love of Greece and Greek culture, which was to become a powerful force in European politics and culture, especially in the 19th century, when the Greeks themselves were fighting for their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Bartholomew's Anacharsis was not just a book, it was a phenomenon, a cultural event that helped to shape the imagination of an entire generation. And it is important to understand why it had such an impact, because it came at a time when Europe was fascinated by the ancient world, and when the French Revolution was about to break out, and when people were looking for models of liberty and virtue in the past, and they found them in ancient Greece, a land that was associated with democracy, philosophy, and artistic genius. And Bartholomew's book gave them a picture of that world that was both idealized and believable, a picture that made the Greeks seem like real people, with real lives and real problems, and that made their civilization seem like something that could be studied and understood and even emulated. The abbot Bartholomew, who was a true scholar and a true lover of Greece, had poured all his knowledge and all his love into the book, and he had succeeded in creating a work that was both learned and readable, and that, despite its length and its detail, was never boring, because it was full of life and color and human interest, and it made the ancient world seem as real and as immediate as the world of the reader. The long journey of the name of Anacharsis takes a strange and unexpected turn, leading not to the steppes of Scythia, nor to the streets of Athens, nor to the courts of Europe, but to the pages of American literature, to the great whaling novel of Herman Melville, Moby Dick, where the ghost of the Scythian prince appears in a form both familiar and transformed, not the philosopher himself, but his shadow, his echo, his name adopted by another man, a man who lived in a different age and fought for different ideals, but who carried the same restless spirit of inquiry and hunger for justice. This man was Jean-Baptiste Clootz, a Prussian nobleman who, during the French Revolution, took the name Anacharsis as his own, declaring himself the orator of the human race, a spokesman for all of humanity who believed the revolution was a universal event, a prelude to the liberation of all peoples. In 1790, he appeared before the French National Assembly at the head of a delegation of 36 foreigners, representing, he claimed, the whole of humanity, a delegation he called the Embassy of the Human Race, hoping to demonstrate the universal appeal of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Melville, a keen reader of history fascinated by the French Revolution, knew of Clootz and mentions him several times in his works. His most famous reference occurs in Moby Dick, where, describing the crew of the Pequod, he writes that it was like an Anacharsis Clootz deputation from all the isles of the sea and all the ends of the earth, a phrase capturing the extraordinary diversity of the whaling ship, which brought together men from every corner of the globe, men of different races, religions, languages, and cultures, all united in a single vessel, a floating microcosm of the human race. This image, both beautiful and ironic, echoes Clootz's grand vision of a universal republic, a vision noble and inspiring, but also, as Melville knew, tragically flawed. The phrase is not simply a celebration of diversity, because it contains a dark irony, a reminder that the ideals of the revolution, of universal brotherhood, were not as universal as they claimed, and that Clootz's grand delegation had failed to represent all of humanity, leaving out, among others, the people of Africa. This omission, noted by many critics, was not accidental, but a reflection of the deep-seated racism that existed even among the most ardent revolutionaries, a racism Melville, a sharp critic of his own society, was keenly aware of and wanted to expose through his fiction. In this sense, the reference to Clootz is a subtle and powerful critique of the limitations of revolutionary idealism, a reminder that the high ideals of the revolution were not always matched by reality, and that the struggle for universal justice is a never-ending one, a struggle that must constantly confront its own shortcomings. The ghost of Clootz, which haunts the pages of Moby Dick, is also the ghost of the original Anacharsis, a man who also tried to bridge the gap between cultures, and who also failed, but whose failure was not the end of the story, but only the beginning of a long and unfinished journey. Clootz also appears in Melville's later works, The Confidence Man and Billy Budd, where he serves as a symbol of the tension between the ideal of universal brotherhood and the reality of racial and social inequality. His presence reminds us that the struggle for justice is never easy, and that the ideals of the past, however noble, must always be re-examined in the light of new challenges and new circumstances. This is the ultimate lesson of the long and fascinating story of Anacharsis, a story that begins in the steppes of Scythia and ends, for now, in the pages of an American novel, but that will no doubt continue to echo in the minds of those who seek to understand the complex and ever-changing relationship between wisdom, culture, and the human condition.